August 23rd, 1987. It's a warm Sunday in Hammond, Louisiana, a college town of 20,000 an hour north of New Orleans.
It's known for one of the nation's fastest growing universities, Southeastern Louisiana University.
There's still a tight-knit community of people who are locals, but it's definitely a college town.
But that morning, it's not a student that's suddenly absent. It's 26-year-old wife and mother, Salonia Reed.
On August 23rd, Reginald Reed made a call to Hammond police because he said his wife, Lonnie, had not returned from a night out with friends.
Hammond police.
I would like to file a missing persons report.
Reggie said he stayed at home with the couple's 6-year-old son.
Okay.
And it wasn't until he woke up the next morning that he observed that she had not returned home.
Is that normal for her?
She's never stayed out all night like this before.
And there's nowhere else she could be?
No, not that I can think of.
Okay. We just need to cover all our bases.
He says she always returns home, especially before our son would wake up in the morning.
Lonnie was very responsible, had a very close relationship with their son. So at that time, Reginald was frantic.
This is not like her. I'm afraid something happened to her.
Louisiana native Salonia Smith always made friends wherever she went.
She was affectionately known to her family and friends as Lonnie. She was a vibrant 26-year-old woman, and she knew how to let her hair down.
However, she was no stranger to hard work.
After high school, Salonia went to work at a hospital there in Hammond.
She worked in the records department.
Her attention to detail and people skills served her well in the position.
This also allowed her to create stronger relationships with her colleagues.
And it was through one of those colleagues that Salonia first met Reginald Reed.
The brother of one of her co-workers, Reggie, had recently come home from serving in the Marines.
So I hear you're an MVP at your office.
I don't know about that.
Lonnie's not looking for love at that time. However, upon meeting Reginald, there was a connection there.
Glad my sister introduced us.
So am I.
She found him attractive and charming and liked the attention that he showered on her.
She fell in love with him with her, and they ended up having a really whirlwind romance.
They also had shared interests and values.
Family was very important to both of them.
Reggie was also very involved in local politics.
That's one thing my dad was big on politics. He worked significantly on other people's campaigns, whether it was state senators, governors, judges.
He even dreamed of running for office himself one day.
They both had aspirations to do well in life, and so that drive kind of connected them.
And it wasn't long before fate took their commitment to the next level.
When Lonnie found out that she was pregnant, she was overjoyed.
And Reggie was just as thrilled.
They got married and had a baby all within the first year.
She's never been out all night like this.
But now, not long after their son's 6th birthday, Reggie has called police to report Salonia missing.
Reginald reported to police that she had been out with some friends.
She said he was going out for a couple drinks.
So he was worried because he didn't know where she was.
He didn't have any way to reach out to her.
All he can do is give police the name of the friend she was supposed to meet.
He says she went out with her friend Darlene to a bar.
He said he tried calling the bar, but it wasn't open yet.
He's also unable to reach Darlene.
I'll get that information up to the detectives. And I promise we'll do everything we can to find her.
All right, thank you.
But that's not a problem for the police.
Hammond police were able to reach out to her.
Hello?
Yes, Miss Miller.
But when the detectives reached Darlene, she's not sure why they're calling.
Reggie said she was with me last night?
Darlene says there must be some misunderstanding.
Lonnie and I didn't have plans last night.
Okay.
It wasn't like they just canceled at the last minute.
They had not seen one another for several weeks.
To most people in the small town of Hammond, Louisiana, it looked like Salonia Reed had it all.
I'd like to see a little bit more.
She had met this man that she loved.
She had her job, her family, her child.
But now, Lonnie is missing. And the friend she was supposedly with the night before says that she hasn't seen her in a couple of weeks.
So she was very surprised that Reginald assumed that Bonnie was with her.
We've been meaning to hang out for some time, but things never worked out.
Reggie said you guys were together.
They both had busy schedules, and so it was difficult for them to hang out.
Maybe Reggie misunderstood and thought we were going out?
She also told police that she wasn't familiar with the bar that Reggie mentioned.
Maybe Reggie mixed me up with someone else?
Okay. Thank you, Miss Miller.
Sorry. Thank you.
Their first lead a dead end. The detectives wonder if Reggie had been completely honest with them.
Maybe he'd done something to Salonia and made up the whole story about how she hadn't come home last night.
Or was it possible Salonia had been lying to her husband?
Could she have told her husband she was going to be with someone and was really meeting someone else?
It could explain why she hadn't come home last night.
Even though one spouse is saying the relationship is perfectly fine, it's always a possibility that there could be something nefarious going on.
But before detectives get the chance to circle back to Reggie, they get a new lead in the case.
My husband was on a walk this morning.
A woman brought a wallet into the police station and said, "Hey, my husband found this woman's wallet."
She said her husband found it lying in the ditch like it had been tossed out of a passing car.
It had all of these credit cards and personal information in it, and this woman just wanted to make sure that she got that wallet to authorities.
And after the desk sergeant looked at the identification inside the wallet, he passed it along to the detectives.
Woman dropped this off lost and found. Figured you might be interested.
The wallet turned out to belong to Salonia Reed.
That's a big break.
Come look at this.
Being that she brought it to us, that kind of gave us a place to start looking.
But it also raises some disturbing questions.
How did her wallet end up over in a ditch?
It's starting to look like there might be some foul play involved.
Hoping to learn more, the detectives head to the location where the woman's husband found the wallet.
It wasn't far from Reginald and Salonia's home.
Now, this is in 1987. There aren't things like surveillance video, but as detectives, we still want to look for any type of clues that we can.
While the detectives start knocking on doors in the area, patrol officers conduct a wider sweep.
In investigations, usually we have patrolmen who canvass the area, see if they notice anything that may stand out.
And it doesn't take long for them to find something.
This officer sees this vehicle that looks like it could be Salonia's car.
Louisiana Bravo 899.
It was parked in an abandoned parking lot near a car wash.
He puts in the license plate and confirms it is her vehicle.
That's a big break in the case.
Only it's about to get even bigger.
After radioing in that he'd found the car, the officer got out and approached the vehicle.
At first, they thought the vehicle had just been parked there.
But while the car had been abandoned, it wasn't empty.
There was a black woman slumped inside the vehicle.
Give me a detective in major crime side here.
And she's covered in blood.
Just hours after Salonia Reed's husband Reggie reported her missing, police have found a woman's dead body inside her abandoned vehicle.
I imagine that's pretty shocking to see. To come across this vehicle and you find a deceased person inside of it.
Within minutes, the detectives arrive on the scene as yellow tape goes up around the vehicle.
The first thing is to block off that area, because right now the crime scene is the most important thing that we have.
While it will take an autopsy to confirm it, the detectives believe the woman is Salonia.
Salonia's body was slumped in the passenger seat. She had trauma to her face, and they were able to tell that she had multiple stab wounds in her chest and throat area.
But they noticed it's not really a knife-shaped stab wound. It could be something smaller, like a screwdriver. They also suspect that she might have been sexually assaulted.
After the coroner's team removes the body, the detectives conduct a search of the car.
They don't find much evidence, but they do find a small cigarette butt.
The detectives suspect the killer could have left it behind.
They did bag it for evidence.
Although proving it won't be easy.
In the 1980s, DNA was still in its infancy stage. All of these different testings that you can do to solve a case now. The police at that time did not have access to it.
Then, while crime scene investigators arrange for the car to be towed to impound, the detectives contact Lonnie's husband.
Police now have the tough task of telling Reginald that his wife has passed away.
Have a seat. Hey, Reggie. We appreciate you coming down to the station today.
Have you guys found Lonnie?
They tell him that we found her. At that time, Reggie, he breaks down.
Lonnie's been murdered.
He's distraught. He's unsure of how this could possibly have happened.
But the detectives do have some follow-up questions for him.
We understand that this is very hard, but we need to know what happened that day before she left.
Well, she was out most of the morning with her sister.
According to Reggie, Lonnie had spent time with her sister.
After that, Reggie and Lonnie had taken their son shopping.
We got Reggie Jr. some shoes, and Lonnie got a new outfit.
They had this great day. They came back home, and Salonia decided she was going out with her friend Darlene.
At least according to Reggie, that's who Lonnie said she was meeting.
You look nice.
Thank you.
Reggie says that while Lonnie was out, he stayed home with his son.
Reggie says that around 10 o'clock, she called home and said she was having a great time and she would stay out a little bit longer.
He didn't think anything of it at the time.
Yeah, I can pull him out of bed. You guys have fun.
He said he didn't even know she didn't come home till he woke up the next morning.
He was very surprised when he discovered that she was no longer at the house.
And now, it's the detective's turn to give him another shock.
We spoke to Darlene, Reggie.
She said she didn't meet up with Lonnie last night.
That doesn't make any sense.
He's baffled. He has no idea who she could have been with the night before if she wasn't with Darlene.
Would Lonnie have any reason to lie?
No, not that I can think of.
Well, she might have had her reasons.
The police ask him, well, could she have been in an extramarital affair or been with someone else?
No, that's impossible.
He also suggested they speak to Lonnie's sister, Angela.
He figured that if she was not with Darlene and had been out with someone else, that Angela would be the one to know.
Okay. We'll talk to Angela.
I'll show you out.
When the detectives sit down with Salonia's sister, she's still struggling to process the news that Salonia is dead.
We know this is a really difficult time.
I don't believe it. I was just with her.
And that's what we want to talk to you about.
She did confirm to police that she did get a ride from Salonia the day before her murder.
Did it seem like anything was bothering her?
No, I don't think so.
Police go on to ask Angela, who else could your sister have been with, last night if she was not with Darlene?
Honestly, I have no idea. I don't even think she went out much.
The detectives ask if it's possible Lonnie was having an affair.
No, Lonnie wouldn't cheat.
But according to her sister, Lonnie's marriage wasn't perfect.
She did have the sense that there was some sort of trouble in the marriage.
But it had nothing to do with another man.
Honestly, her biggest problem was Reggie.
Detectives investigating Salonia Reed's murder have just learned from her sister that the 26-year-old didn't have a very happy marriage with her husband, Reginald.
Their marriage, while it looked good on the outside, it was more of a facade. Over the years, their marriage had become a bit tumultuous.
Angela said it had gotten bad enough to where she didn't like going over to her sister's house when Reggie was around.
And what do you mean by that?
Just the way he talked to her.
He would belittle her.
She's also heard some threats.
And there were some signs that there could have been abuse.
Physical abuse?
Yeah, I think so.
She stated that she's never seen Reggie be physical with Salonia, but she has seen some marks on her.
But every time I tried to ask her anything, there was always some excuse.
She said Salonia didn't really talk about her personal life.
Although according to Angela, she didn't have to.
She could see that her sister wasn't very happy, even though she put on a brave face. Angela felt like it was all a facade.
Lonnie's sister says that Reggie was just as unhappy.
Reginald had recently told Salonia he wanted a divorce.
He was ready for them to live separate lives and just be co-parents to their son.
But Angela says her sister felt conflicted.
Angela says she didn't want to split up her family.
She really wanted her marriage to work.
According to Salonia's sister, this had led the couple to an uncomfortable compromise.
They had started living a somewhat separate life.
In the morning, Reggie would come home when Salonia was going to work, and when Salonia would come back, Reggie would leave.
But he would watch their son when she wanted to go out.
No, not that I was aware of.
She says Reggie's extremely jealous and possessive, and he would not have allowed Salonia to go out while he babysat at home. I call those uh-oh moments of an investigation when somebody tells you a story that turns out to be the complete opposite of what other people are telling you.
But when detectives ask Angela point blank if she thinks Reggie is behind the murder, she hesitates.
She suggested that there was someone Lonnie was truly scared of, but that it wasn't her husband.
Her neighbor? She said he was really creepy.
Something just wasn't right about this guy.
His name is Jimmy Ray Barnes.
Angela told the police that Salonia was always a little leery of Jimmy Ray.
Angela said she would have to come over some of those nights when Reginald was out and she would stay with Salonia to keep her company.
That dude was always hanging around.
What do you mean?
Lonnie said he was always watching her.
The things that she let the detective know kind of raised some red flags.
The way she described Jimmy Ray, he sounded like a stalker.
But does that mean he was Lonnie's killer?
They thought that maybe she was possibly sexually assaulted. So maybe Jimmy had something to do with that.
Again, we're very sorry for your loss.
Come on, Angela, I'll escort you back out.
When the detectives bring Jimmy Ray in, he admits to knowing the Reeds.
Have a seat, Jimmy.
He says, I do yard work for them sometimes.
Reggie pays me to mow the lawn and wash their cars, stuff like that.
He informed them that Saturday he was actually at their house doing yard work.
So where'd you go after that?
I went to the bar and got me a drink.
Jimmy Ray says, I spent Saturday night in a bar a couple of blocks away that I walked to, and I didn't see Reginald at night on Saturday at all.
He also denies knowing anything about Salonia's death.
No, sir. She was a nice little lady.
We'll be in touch.
He claims he had nothing to do with it.
However, when the detectives follow up on Jimmy Ray's alibi, it isn't as solid as he claims.
When they go to the bar that Jimmy Ray said he was at, the bartender said, no, I can't tell you that he was here Saturday night.
They couldn't find anyone else who saw him at the bar that night either.
But just as detectives are starting to suspect Jimmy Ray, they get an unsolicited call from a local insurance agent.
Homicide.
He said a client of his had recently come by and was trying to cash out on several insurance policies.
There was 5 policies totaling upwards of $700,000.
And that client was Reginald Reed.
Detectives investigating Salonia Reed's murder have learned that her husband Reginald has made inquiries about cashing in on her life insurance.
Altogether, he was looking at receiving over $500,000.
What was interesting about these insurance policies is that 3 of them had been written only days before the murder.
Could that insurance payoff be a motive for murder?
That's 500,000 reasons to kill Salonia.
Several of the policies pay double in the event of an accidental death.
Reginald wanted to make sure that the policies covered accidental death.
Like he knew something may happen to the victim really soon.
However, a compelling financial motive and rumors of a troubled marriage aren't enough for an arrest warrant.
It's not about what you know. It's about what you can prove in court.
Everything was circumstantial evidence.
Until, as the news of Salonia's murder spreads,
Homicide.
the detectives get another break.
A woman called police and said she had seen something suspicious happening the night of August 22nd.
That's the night Salonia disappeared.
The woman tells the detective she had been pumping gas at the convenience store near the car wash and vacant lot where police had found Salonia's body.
And she said these 2 guys caught her eye because they were acting so oddly. They were walking from the car wash into the wooded area, back and forth.
Kind of acting like they were scared to be seen.
Then, a few days later, She'd seen a story about Salonia's murder in the newspaper.
When she saw that Salonia's body had been found in that very location, she came forward to the police.
And the detectives suspect they know the identities of the two men the woman saw.
Police decide to make photo lineups of Jimmy Ray and Reginald to present to the witness, and lo and behold, that witness picks out Reginald and Jimmy Ray as being the two men that she saw the night that Salonia disappeared.
Which suggests that the detectives aren't just investigating a murder. They're also investigating a conspiracy.
The detectives do believe that Reggie and Jimmy have something to do with this homicide.
Maybe Reggie promised Jimmy Ray some of the insurance money if he'd helped him get rid of Salonia's body.
But for all the detectives' suspicion, they're still far from making an arrest.
There isn't enough there to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that these guys are the ones who killed Salonia.
As a result, the case grows cold.
Basically, there's no new information coming in, there's no new leads, the detectives are stuck.
Not long after, Jimmy Ray Barnes moves out of state and settles in Alabama. But Reggie stays in Hammond and cashes in on the insurance settlements.
Reginald was able to cash in on those large insurance policies. He then goes on to live a very prominent life.
Fast forward about a decade, and Reginald decides he's going to run for mayor of his hometown.
But Reggie's life as a public figure sparks renewed interest in Lonnie's murder.
That's when typically all the dirt is brought up when somebody runs for a political office.
There was a local journalist who decided to draw some attention to the case.
An article comes out titled, "Whatever Happened to Salonia Reed?"
In it, the article revisits the rumors that were going around when the murder occurred, insinuating it only could have been Reggie who had done it.
Reggie dismisses the story as nothing but fake news.
He still continues his campaign.
It was very busy, campaigning. We were trying to make it happen.
People still gravitated towards him because of his charisma.
But in the end, the dark cloud of Salonia's murder may have cost him the race.
When Reginald lost the election, it was only by very few votes.
Despite that, Reginald never again ran for public office.
He just kind of fades off into the wind.
But while most around Hammond had all but forgotten Salonia's murder, the police were merely biding their time.
Sometimes we have to wait.
It's not until early 2012, 25 years after the murder occurred, that they finally reopened the case.
They decided to send the cigarette butt that had been recovered out of Salonia's car off to the lab to see if a DNA profile could be made.
Detectives are hoping that new modern technology will give them some sort of DNA confirmation on who actually killed Salonia Reed.
The DNA profile from the cigarette butt is put into the FBI's database.
It came back with a hit. The DNA that was extracted from that cigarette butt matched a DNA profile in the system.
Turns out it's not Reggie's DNA, but it's almost as good.
It linked back to Jimmy.
I finally got a hit. I can't believe it.
For the first time, police working to solve the almost 25-year-old murder of Salonia Reed have physical evidence connecting one of their primary suspects to the crime.
Over the decades, there had been advancement in DNA testing, and so that cigarette butt that was collected in the 1980s became a huge break for the case.
The DNA comes back to Jim, the creepy neighbor. So this cold case is actually back hot.
Now all the detectives have to do is find Jimmy.
At this point, years later, Jimmy has moved to Atlanta.
It's been decades since the murder of Salonia happened, so he's surprised when detectives from Louisiana reach out to him.
He agrees to sit down for an interview, however.
Are you willing to answer questions at this time?
Yeah. But I ain't got nothing to hide.
Initially, Jimmy denied knowing anything about what happened.
But that wasn't good enough for the detectives.
Your DNA's on that murder scene.
Don't believe that. I'll tell you.
What other reason would I want to drive 7 hours from New Orleans here to put a swab in your mouth to get your DNA?
I don't know what to say about it right now. It'll definitely tell this thing, because I know it wasn't me.
While he denies that he had anything to do with it, he did go on to state that it was Reginald that he believed was behind Salonia's murder.
In fact, Jimmy Ray claims that Reggie tried to get him to do it.
He tells a story of how a couple of days or weeks prior, Reginald had actually reached out to him offering him $50,000 to kill his wife.
Did he have $50,000?
I don't know.
He said he absolutely told Reggie no, that he would not participate in that.
Is that something that I could bring you back to Louisiana and put you in court and you testify?
It'd be hard, man, to testify against him because I'm afraid. That's why I'm down here. Really, I'm being honest. I'm scared of him.
He became fearful of his life and ended up in Alabama and then ultimately landed a job in Atlanta.
After talking to Jimmy Ray, the detectives take everything they've learned to the district attorney.
The DA finally felt that with the new DNA evidence that they had more than enough information to go and file charges for second-degree murder on both Jimmy and Reginald.
The police take Reggie Sr. into custody first.
I was working and I get that call from the jail, and it was my dad. And he was held on a $250,000 bond. So at that point, I didn't know what to think.
Jimmy Ray is also arrested in Atlanta and extradited back to Louisiana.
Once the detectives had Jimmy Ray in custody, they applied a little pressure.
Anytime you have more than one person involved, somebody almost always agrees to cooperate to save themselves.
Jimmy comes clean. He tells the detectives that on that Saturday night, he was contacted by Reggie.
I need you to meet me ASAP.
He said, Jimmy Ray, I need you to go to my mom's house and get her car and meet me here at the car wash.
I need you to meet me at the car wash across from the gas station. All right.
Jimmy Ray says he'd done what Reggie asked.
As you were over there, her car was already there. Salon car was already parked, yeah.
According to Jimmy, she was in the passenger seat.
I seen blood coming out of her face, out of her nose.
But he did have an explanation of why his cigarette butt would be in Salonia's car.
He had to set that up and that cigarette butt was put in there.
Jimmy told detectives he thinks that cigarette butt was planted there to frame him.
The detectives and prosecutors don't necessarily believe that, but they do allow Jimmy Ray to make a deal.
Jimmy agrees to testify against Reggie to get a reduced sentence.
And when Reginald Sr. finally goes on trial, Jimmy's testimony is a key part of the prosecution's case.
Prosecutors tell the jury Salonia didn't want a divorce, so Reggie took matters into his own hands.
He tried to outsource the actual killing, but Jimmy refused.
But Reggie wasn't going to give up on his plans so easily.
Not only was this an opportunity for him to end the marriage, but he also looked at it as an opportunity for a payout.
Will you keep your voice down?
So on the night of August 22nd, 1987, he decided it was time to cash in.
Prosecutors weren't sure exactly where the murder occurred, but they knew it was brutal.
I'm not doing this with you.
At that time, I wasn't aware of how gruesome, how brutal the murder was.
She was beaten, she was stabbed.
She was stabbed multiple times.
Then dumped in a vacant lot like a piece of trash.
However, the fact that it's Jimmy Ray's DNA that detectives found in the car and not Reggie's also gives the defense an opening.
The defense's argument is that it was actually Jimmy that was the actual murderer.
Will it be enough to raise reasonable doubt?
It was times where I thought he was gonna be acquitted. It was times I thought that he's gonna be found guilty. My emotions were all over the place.
But in the end, the jury found Reginald Sr. guilty of murder.
Reginald Reed was sentenced to life in prison.
Just hearing that and seeing my dad, and I remember the attorney waved me up and she was like, "You wanna come say bye to your dad?" So I walked up and he kissed me on the forehead. He said, "Everything will be all right." That was it.
And as for Jimmy, he got a 5-year sentence.
The outcome is a tough pill for Reggie Jr. to swallow.
This is the only parent he's ever really known.
You gotta put the bad guys up. They need to learn from their mistakes or wrongdoings. But it's like, I already lived a life without my mother, and now you take my dad away.
It also means the events that happened 3 decades ago will continue to shape his future.
Now I have to live the second half of my life. Getting a call from the jail, I feel like I'm again left holding the bag.
To help deal with the trauma, Salonia's son has written a book about his mother's murder.
It was very cathartic for me and a healing process for me getting it out, talking about it, and it's a way out.
It's also a way to honor the memory of the mother he lost far too soon.
She was a beautiful young girl, and it's so unfortunate that she chose for her spouse someone who was jealous and controlling and abusive.
Salonia never got the opportunity to really see her life fulfilled. To see her son grow up was also taken away.
I know spiritually, we say, oh, your mom's looking over you and so forth. But I wish she was present. And we have a 1-month-old at the house now. And we named her Salonia.
On the morning of May 7, 1992, investigators moved with a quiet confidence that only months of surveillance could produce. There was no dramatic chase through the streets of Brooklyn, no exchange of gunfire beneath flashing police lights, and no mysterious fugitive disappearing into the maze of New York City's neighborhoods. Instead, what unfolded was something far more unsettling. The target of the operation was not a notorious drug kingpin or a violent gang leader. The man at the center of the investigation wore the same badge that thousands of New Yorkers trusted every day. His name was Michael F. Dowd, an officer of the New York City Police Department, and the evidence waiting to be presented against him would expose one of the darkest chapters in the history of modern American policing. For years, residents of East New York had whispered that certain officers seemed impossible to touch. Drug dealers operated with astonishing confidence. Raids failed without explanation. Dealers who should have disappeared into police custody returned to the same street corners only hours later. Entire blocks appeared to function under an invisible agreement that ordinary citizens could sense but never prove. Fear became routine. Silence became survival. The people who lived there could not always distinguish where organized crime ended and where law enforcement began. The arrest of Michael Dowd shattered that invisible boundary. As investigators peeled back the layers of corruption, they discovered something that reached far beyond a single dishonest officer accepting an occasional bribe. The evidence pointed toward an entire criminal enterprise operating beneath the uniform of the NYPD. Officers entrusted with protecting neighborhoods had instead been protecting narcotics traffickers. Police equipment had been used to facilitate crimes rather than prevent them. Confidential information had allegedly been exchanged for cash. Weapons and ammunition had found their way into criminal hands. Cocaine moved through networks that included individuals sworn to uphold the law. The revelation stunned the city because they challenged one of society's most basic assumptions. Criminal organizations were expected to hide from the police. In this case, according to the later investigations and court proceedings, some criminals had found allies inside the department itself. To understand how such a system could develop, it is necessary to return to New York during the late 1980s, when the city stood at the center of one of the most devastating drug epidemics in American history. Crack cocaine spread through neighborhoods with extraordinary speed, bringing violence that transformed entire communities almost overnight. Homicide numbers climbed above 2,000 per year. Emergency sirens became part of the soundtrack of daily life. Families learned to distinguish fireworks from gunshots without looking outside their windows. Children grew up avoiding certain corners because everyone understood what happened there after dark. Among the neighborhoods most deeply affected was East New York in Brooklyn. Rows of apartment buildings stood beside abandoned lots. Graffiti covered walls that had not been repainted in years. Burnt-out buildings served as reminders of fires, neglect, and poverty. Drug markets operated openly in places where children walked to school only hours earlier. Residents often felt trapped between heavily armed street gangs and a criminal justice system struggling to keep pace with an ever-changing landscape. Police officers assigned to the 75th Precinct entered this environment every day. Many officers performed difficult work under extraordinary pressure. They answered dangerous calls, confronted armed suspects, and faced risks that few professions demanded. Yet the same environment also presented constant temptation. Patrol officers regularly encountered large amounts of cash during narcotics investigations. Drugs with enormous street value passed through police custody. Decisions made within seconds could determine whether evidence reached a courtroom or disappeared forever. Most officers resisted those temptations. Some did not. Michael Dowd joined the NYPD in 1982, years before his name would become synonymous with police corruption. Like thousands of recruits before him, he entered an institution built upon discipline, authority, and public trust. The badge represented responsibility. The uniform represented legitimacy. Every arrest, every search, every use of force depended upon citizens believing that officers exercised power honestly. According to later testimony and investigative findings, that belief gradually eroded in Dowd's own career. The transformation did not occur in a single dramatic moment. There was no documented instant when a respected officer suddenly decided to become a criminal. Instead, the change appeared incremental. Small compromises became easier after the first one. A free meal from a local business. A complimentary drink. Minor favors that seemed harmless when viewed individually. The line separating professional courtesy from personal benefit slowly became blurred. What once might have seemed unacceptable began to feel ordinary. The psychological danger of corruption often lies not in its size but in its gradual nature. People rarely recognize the exact moment they cross an ethical boundary because each individual step appears insignificant compared with the one before it. Years later, Dowd himself would describe a progression in which increasingly serious misconduct followed those early compromises. As investigators reconstructed the timeline, allegations expanded far beyond gratuities. Money from drug traffickers allegedly replaced small gifts. Evidence was reportedly withheld. Drug transactions were ignored rather than interrupted. Payments were accepted in exchange for protection. The authority granted by the badge became, according to prosecutors, a valuable commodity available for purchase. The consequences reached far beyond individual crimes. Every compromised investigation strengthened criminal organizations already profiting from addiction and violence. Every warning allegedly provided before a police raid allowed traffickers to protect their operations. Every dishonest decision weakened the credibility of honest officers working alongside colleagues they believed they could trust. Yet for years, the system continued. One of the most disturbing aspects of the Dowd case was not simply the misconduct itself but the length of time it allegedly persisted. Complaints accumulated. Internal reports existed. Questions were raised. Despite these warning signs, meaningful intervention failed to stop the pattern before it expanded further. That failure would later become one of the central questions examined after the scandal exploded into public view. How could an officer facing repeated allegations continue serving in one of New York City's most challenging precincts? Were warning signs overlooked, dismissed, or inadequately investigated? Did institutional weaknesses allow corruption to flourish where accountability should have intervened? These questions extended beyond Michael Dowd alone. They challenged the systems responsible for identifying misconduct before it became entrenched. At the same time, life continued for the residents of East New York. Parents still escorted children to school. Store owners unlocked metal security gates every morning. Churches filled on Sundays. Neighbors looked after one another in communities often portrayed only through crime statistics. Many families had no connection whatsoever to narcotics trafficking, yet they lived with its consequences every day. They watched businesses close, property values decline, and violence reshape familiar streets. Trust in public institutions became increasingly fragile as rumors circulated that some officers might be working with the very people they were assigned to arrest. Rumors alone do not prove corruption. Evidence does. That evidence began emerging not through routine internal oversight within the NYPD but through an investigation conducted by the Suffolk County Police Department on Long Island. What investigators there uncovered would eventually expose relationships extending into Brooklyn and reveal alleged criminal conduct involving sworn law enforcement officers. Their investigation unfolded patiently. Surveillance replaced speculation. Documentation replaced rumor. Financial patterns, meetings, and suspected narcotics activity gradually formed a picture that investigators believed could withstand judicial scrutiny. As the case developed, authorities concluded they were no longer examining isolated misconduct. They believed they had uncovered organized criminal behavior involving police officers abusing official authority for personal profit. The implications reached far beyond courtroom proceedings. Public confidence in policing depends upon legitimacy. Officers possess extraordinary legal powers because society expects those powers to be exercised fairly and lawfully. When corruption enters that relationship, every legitimate arrest risks being questioned. Every honest officer bears the burden created by dishonest colleagues. Communities already struggling with violence become even less willing to cooperate with investigators if they believe the system itself has been compromised. By the time Michael Dowd was arrested, the story had already become larger than one man. It had become a mirror reflecting uncomfortable truths about institutional oversight, human temptation, and the corrosive effects of unchecked power. Over the months and years that followed, guilty pleas, testimony, judicial proceedings, and the work of the Mullen Commission would expose failures that reshaped conversations about police accountability throughout New York City. The scandal would influence reforms, investigative practices, and ethics training for decades afterward. It would also inspire documentaries, books, and continuing debate about how corruption develops inside organizations built upon public trust. But before commissions issued reports and courtrooms heard testimony, there was simply a city living through one of its most turbulent eras, a police department confronting pressures unlike any in its modern history, and an officer whose descent into corruption would become one of the most infamous cautionary tales in American law enforcement. That is where this story truly begins. New York City in the late 1980s was a place of relentless contrasts. On one side of Manhattan, towering office buildings reflected ambition, wealth, and the promise of a financial capital that never seemed to sleep. Only a few miles away, entire neighborhoods were trapped in cycles of violence, addiction, and poverty that seemed impossible to escape. Every day, millions of people woke to the same skyline, rode the same subway system, and shared the same city, yet their realities could not have been more different. For many Americans watching the evening news, New York had become the symbol of urban crime. Newspaper headlines were filled with shootings, robberies, gang disputes, and drug-related homicides. Television broadcasts showed flashing patrol cars, yellow crime scene tape, grieving families, and crowded emergency rooms. The statistics alone painted an alarming picture. Annual homicide numbers climbed beyond 2,000. Crack cocaine spread through borough after borough with astonishing speed, changing neighborhoods faster than governments could respond. But numbers rarely capture what daily life actually feels like. In East New York, Brooklyn, danger was rarely announced by headlines because it had become routine. It lived in ordinary moments. Mothers looked through apartment windows before allowing their children downstairs to play. Elderly residents hurried home before sunset, clutching grocery bags while avoiding eye contact with groups gathered on street corners. Store owners installed heavy steel gates not because they expected trouble every night, but because they assumed it would eventually arrive. The neighborhood carried scars that had accumulated over decades. Factories that once provided stable employment had disappeared. Many buildings stood abandoned, their broken windows staring like empty eyes over cracked sidewalks. Vacant lots collected trash faster than they collected attention from city officials. Fires, whether accidental or deliberate, had left blackened shells where families once lived. Some apartment buildings still held hard-working residents trying desperately to preserve a sense of community. Others had become places where landlords invested little and hope seemed increasingly difficult to maintain. Yet even in this environment, life continued. Children still laughed while chasing basketballs across cracked playgrounds. Churches opened their doors every Sunday. Local barbers knew every customer by name. Grandparents sat near windows watching grandchildren return from school. Birthdays were celebrated. Weddings took place. Families shared meals around small kitchen tables while trying to convince themselves tomorrow would somehow be better. The neighborhood was not defined solely by crime. It was defined by people determined to survive despite it. Unfortunately, survival often meant learning rules that existed outside the law. Residents understood which streets became dangerous after dark. They recognized which stairwells belonged to drug dealers. They knew which abandoned buildings concealed narcotics operations. They avoided asking unnecessary questions because curiosity could attract attention from the wrong people. Silence became a survival skill. The crack cocaine epidemic accelerated these realities with devastating speed. Unlike previous drug markets, crack cocaine generated enormous profits through countless small street-level transactions. Dealers did not need luxurious hideouts or distant warehouses. Business happened openly. Apartment hallways became marketplaces. Street corners transformed into 24-hour businesses. Lookouts watched approaching vehicles while runners carried drugs between customers and suppliers. Cash flowed continuously through neighborhoods where legitimate employment opportunities had become increasingly scarce. Money attracted violence. Territory became everything. A single block could produce thousands of dollars in illegal revenue each day. Rival crews fought over those profits with extraordinary brutality. Gunfire echoed between apartment buildings. Innocent bystanders were caught in conflicts that had nothing to do with them. Ambulance sirens became so common that some residents barely paused when they heard them. Police officers entered this environment every shift. Many responded to domestic disputes 1 hour and homicide scenes the next. They encountered frightened children, grieving parents, armed suspects, and exhausted emergency workers. Every patrol carried uncertainty because routine traffic stops could suddenly become deadly encounters. The emotional strain was immense. Young officers entered neighborhoods where they were viewed with suspicion by many residents and targeted by dangerous criminals. Split-second decisions carried enormous consequences. Every call had the potential to become life-threatening. For countless officers, these pressures reinforced a commitment to duty. Others gradually developed different priorities. The 75th Precinct covered one of the city's most difficult assignments. The station house itself stood as a symbol of authority surrounded by communities facing extraordinary challenges. Patrol cars left its parking lot every day carrying officers expected to restore order in places where violence often seemed deeply rooted. The workload was overwhelming. Drug arrests, robberies, assaults, and shootings consumed enormous resources. Inside the precinct, reputations mattered. Experienced officers often influenced younger colleagues. New recruits learned not only official procedures taught at the police academy but also informal habits passed between generations of patrol officers. Some lessons emphasized caution, professionalism, and discipline. Others reflected a culture shaped by years of frustration and exposure to constant criminal activity. It was within this demanding environment that Michael Dowd built his career. When he joined the NYPD in 1982, nothing publicly suggested that he would eventually become one of the department's most notorious corruption cases. He wore the same uniform as thousands of other officers. He carried the same badge. He took the same oath promising to uphold the law. Those who later investigated his crimes would ask an uncomfortable question. How does someone entrusted with enforcing the law gradually become willing to violate nearly every principle behind that responsibility? There was no evidence that the transformation happened overnight. According to Dowd's later testimony, the earliest compromises appeared remarkably ordinary. A restaurant owner refused payment for lunch. Someone offered free drinks. Small favors came without requests for immediate repayment. Such gestures were not unique to one neighborhood. Police officers across the country have long debated the ethics of accepting gratuities. Supporters sometimes argue that free coffee or discounted meals simply reflect public appreciation. Critics warn that even small gifts can create expectations and slowly weaken professional independence. Dowd later described these seemingly insignificant benefits as the beginning of a much larger ethical collapse. The human mind possesses an extraordinary ability to justify gradual change. One free meal becomes harmless. A second no longer feels unusual. Soon, refusing similar offers begins to seem unnecessary. The behavior becomes routine. Once the original boundary disappears, crossing the next one requires less resistance. Psychologists sometimes describe this process as incremental normalization, where repeated exposure to misconduct gradually changes what feels acceptable. People rarely wake up intending to commit serious crimes. Instead, each compromise makes the following compromise appear slightly less significant. According to prosecutors and later admissions, that progression eventually led Dowd far beyond gratuities. Money entered the equation. Drug traffickers discovered that corrupt officers could provide something more valuable than narcotics themselves. Protection. Information. Predictability. If police activity could be anticipated, illegal businesses became dramatically safer. Advance warning of raids allowed drugs to disappear before investigators arrived. Knowing which officers could be trusted created opportunities to move narcotics with reduced risk. Every confidential detail possessed financial value. For criminal organizations, buying cooperation could prove cheaper than constantly replacing seized drugs and arrested employees. the relationship allegedly evolved into something resembling a business partnership. Investigators would later argue that Dowd was no longer merely accepting bribes to ignore criminal activity. He had begun actively supporting it. This distinction became crucial. Passive corruption allows crime to continue. Active corruption helps crime expand. Meanwhile, life inside the precinct continued much as before. Shift changes. Roll calls. Patrol assignments. Paperwork. Court appearances. The daily machinery of policing continued operating while hidden misconduct allegedly unfolded beneath its surface. What made the situation especially troubling was that warning signs reportedly existed long before the eventual arrests. Complaints accumulated. Citizens filed reports. Internal concerns surfaced. Yet meaningful intervention never arrived. Whether because evidence appeared insufficient, investigations lacked urgency, or institutional systems failed to connect repeated allegations, the outcome remained the same. Michael Dowd stayed on patrol. Each additional year allowed alleged misconduct to deepen. Outside the precinct walls, residents developed their own explanations. People living in neighborhoods affected by open-air drug markets often noticed patterns long before official investigations confirmed them. Dealers who escaped arrest repeatedly attracted suspicion. Police operations that consistently failed raised questions. Certain individuals seemed unusually confident when law enforcement vehicles approached. Rumors spread quickly. Some believed specific officers had been compromised. Others dismissed such claims as conspiracy theories born from distrust. Without evidence, certainty remained impossible. For honest officers assigned to the same streets, these rumors created another burden. Every unethical colleague damaged public confidence in everyone wearing the same uniform. An officer acting with integrity could still face suspicion because residents had no reliable way to distinguish honesty from corruption. Trust, once weakened, proved remarkably difficult to restore. The tragedy extended beyond criminal prosecutions. Communities already suffering from violence depended upon effective policing. Honest officers depended upon community cooperation. Victims depended upon reliable investigations. Every act of corruption weakened each of those relationships simultaneously. By the beginning of the 1990s, New York City stood at a crossroads. Public officials demanded tougher responses to violent crime. Communities demanded safer streets. Police departments expanded narcotics enforcement. Yet beneath these efforts, investigators outside the NYPD were quietly assembling evidence suggesting that some officers charged with fighting the drug trade had instead become participants within it. The investigation remained largely invisible to the public. Surveillance required patience. Financial records required analysis. Witnesses required careful evaluation. Investigators understood that accusations against police officers demanded especially strong evidence. Public trust depended upon both exposing genuine corruption and avoiding unsupported allegations. Every observation had to be documented. Every meeting had to be verified. Every piece of evidence had to withstand scrutiny. The investigation slowly advanced toward a moment that would force New York City to confront uncomfortable truths about power, accountability, and the consequences of institutional failure. At the center of that storm stood Michael Dowd, a patrol officer whose career had begun with the authority to enforce the law but who, according to the evidence that investigators continued gathering, had become increasingly entangled with the very criminal world he had sworn to fight. The city did not yet know how extensive those allegations would become, but the foundations of one of the most consequential police corruption scandals in modern American history were already beginning to crack beneath the surface. Unlike many true crime stories, this case did not revolve around a single victim whose life was stolen in one terrible night. There was no lone crime scene sealed behind yellow tape, no single grieving family waiting for detectives to knock on their door, and no one suspect hiding from justice after committing an isolated act of violence. The victims in the Michael Dowd case were far more difficult to identify because they were spread across an entire city. Some never learned they had become victims at all. Others suspected it for years but could never prove it. Many of them lived in East New York, Brooklyn, a neighborhood that had already endured more than its share of hardship before corruption inside law enforcement made that burden even heavier. To understand the true cost of this scandal, it is necessary to look beyond the courtroom and beyond Michael Dowd himself. The greatest damage was not measured by the amount of money exchanged in bribes or by the kilograms of cocaine that investigators eventually linked to corrupt officers. It was measured in broken trust. Every honest resident who dialed 911 expecting help depended on one simple belief, that the officer arriving at the scene represented the law rather than personal profit. Every witness willing to identify a violent criminal accepted enormous personal risk because they believed police would protect them. Every parent who told their child that police officers were there to keep people safe relied on that same belief. When corruption entered that relationship, every one of those assumptions became fragile. East New York was home to thousands of ordinary families whose lives rarely appeared in newspaper headlines. Before sunrise, subway platforms filled with construction workers heading toward Manhattan. Hospital employees finished overnight shifts. Bus drivers prepared for another day navigating crowded streets. Small business owners unlocked storefronts that had survived burglaries, vandalism, and economic decline. Children in neatly pressed school uniforms walked past abandoned buildings on their way to classrooms where teachers worked tirelessly to convince them that education could still change their future. Most residents were not involved in gangs. Most had never sold narcotics. Most wanted exactly what families everywhere wanted, a safe place to live, steady employment, and confidence that tomorrow would be a little better than today. Instead, they found themselves living in one of the most dangerous neighborhoods in America. The crack cocaine epidemic did more than increase crime. It reshaped daily life. Apartment hallways that once echoed with conversations between neighbors became places where strangers conducted quick drug transactions. Playgrounds emptied earlier in the evening. Parents developed routines designed entirely around avoiding violence. Some children learned to sleep through distant gunfire because waking every time was emotionally exhausting. Others instinctively dropped to the floor whenever they heard loud bangs, unable to distinguish fireworks from gunshots. Fear became ordinary. What made that fear even more painful was uncertainty about whom to trust. Imagine calling the police after witnessing a violent assault. Imagine risking retaliation from dangerous criminals because you believe law enforcement will protect your identity. Now imagine discovering that information about police investigations might somehow reach the very people you feared. Even the possibility of such betrayal could silence an entire community. That silence benefited organized crime. Drug organizations relied upon intimidation, but they also depended on information. Knowing when investigators planned raids. Knowing which officers could be influenced. Knowing which arrests would never happen. If those advantages could be purchased, criminal enterprises gained something far more valuable than money. They gained time. Time to sell more narcotics. Time to recruit more young people. Time to strengthen their operations while communities continued suffering. Among the unseen victims were the countless individuals trapped by addiction. Crack cocaine spread with astonishing speed because it created powerful dependence while remaining relatively inexpensive compared to powdered cocaine. Entire families watched loved ones change before their eyes. Parents lost children. Children lost parents. Savings disappeared. Jobs vanished. Apartments were abandoned. Treatment resources struggled to meet overwhelming demand. Every additional shipment of narcotics reaching neighborhood streets carried consequences that extended far beyond those purchasing the drugs. Violence often followed addiction. Robberies increased. Arguments escalated into shootings. Desperation transformed ordinary people into individuals willing to commit crimes they might never have imagined under different circumstances. The epidemic consumed lives one decision at a time. Every successful drug operation required protection from law enforcement. If corrupt officers allegedly provided that protection, the damage multiplied. Investigators later argued that this was precisely why police corruption represented such a unique threat. An ordinary criminal possesses limited authority. A police officer possesses extraordinary authority granted by society itself. Badges open doors. Uniforms create instant credibility. Police vehicles move through neighborhoods without attracting suspicion. Citizens answer officers' questions because they believe those questions serve justice. When those powers are abused, the harm extends well beyond individual criminal acts. Another group of victims rarely discussed during the investigation consisted of honest NYPD officers. Thousands of men and women reported for duty every day, determined to enforce the law fairly. Many accepted dangerous assignments with little public recognition. Some were injured protecting strangers. Others lost colleagues during violent confrontations. They understood the risks before putting on the uniform each morning. What they could not control was the damage caused by colleagues who chose corruption. Public confidence does not distinguish between one officer and another. When a major corruption scandal becomes public, suspicion often spreads across the entire institution. An honest detective interviewing witnesses may encounter unexpected reluctance because previous betrayals have destroyed trust. A patrol officer responding to an emergency may discover that residents hesitate before cooperating. Every ethical officer suddenly inherits the consequences of misconduct committed by someone else. That burden cannot easily be measured. It appears in delayed investigations, unreported crimes, reluctant witnesses, communities withdrawing from relationships that policing depends upon. Trust, once broken, rarely returns quickly. The Michael Dowd investigation would later reveal that allegations against him had surfaced repeatedly before his eventual arrest. According to later findings, complaints had accumulated over several years. From the perspective of ordinary citizens, that reality raised deeply unsettling questions. If concerns had been reported, why had they failed to stop the misconduct? If warning signs existed, why had meaningful action not followed? Every unanswered complaint potentially discouraged future reporting. Imagine gathering the courage to file a complaint against a police officer. Imagine believing your concerns would receive careful attention. Then imagine watching nothing appear to change. The next witness might decide silence felt safer. That silence protected corruption. It also isolated honest officers trying to identify misconduct within their own ranks. Institutional accountability depends upon information moving upward through the chain of command. When information fails to produce meaningful action, confidence gradually disappears. Yet even amid these difficult realities, East New York refused to surrender completely. Community organizations continued organizing youth programs. Churches opened food pantries. Teachers spent extra hours helping struggling students. Local activists attended neighborhood meetings demanding better housing, safer streets, and greater investment. Parents volunteered in schools despite working multiple jobs. These efforts rarely attracted television cameras because resilience seldom generates headlines. Crime does. Scandal does. Corruption does. But resilience quietly continued nonetheless. It is important to remember this because reducing East New York solely to violence overlooks the people who fought every day against that reputation. Many residents remained deeply committed to improving their community despite overwhelming obstacles. Their frustration with corruption came precisely because they believed their neighborhood deserved better. The scandal surrounding Michael Dowd represented more than individual criminal behavior. For many families, it symbolized another broken promise. Government officials promised protection. Police promised enforcement. Courts promised justice. Yet the allegations suggested that some individuals entrusted with fulfilling those promises had instead strengthened the very criminal networks devastating local communities. The emotional impact reached beyond immediate victims. Children growing up during that era absorbed conflicting messages about authority. Parents encouraged respect for police while privately questioning whether every officer deserved it. Teachers discussed civic responsibility in classrooms where students had already witnessed examples suggesting reality could be far more complicated. Trust became conditional. Cynicism grew. That psychological damage often lasts far longer than criminal investigations themselves. Years after arrests are made and prison sentences imposed, communities continue rebuilding confidence one interaction at a time. Investigators, prosecutors, judges, and reform advocates would later focus extensively on institutional failures. Those discussions were necessary. But behind every policy recommendation stood real people whose daily lives had been shaped by decisions they never made. A grandmother afraid to report neighborhood drug activity. A shop owner paying for reinforced security instead of expanding the business. A teenager believing criminal organizations appeared more powerful than the institutions designed to stop them. An honest officer wondering whether citizens now viewed every badge with suspicion. These were the human faces of the scandal. They rarely appeared in court. Their names seldom entered official reports. Yet they carried much of the burden. As investigators continued gathering evidence against Michael Dowd and others allegedly connected to the corruption network, they were not simply preparing a criminal prosecution. They were confronting a question that extended far beyond one precinct in Brooklyn. What happens when those entrusted with defending the law begin serving themselves instead? The answer could not be found solely in financial records or surveillance photographs. It could be seen in neighborhoods where fear had become routine, in families who no longer knew whom to trust, and in honest public servants forced to rebuild confidence damaged by the actions of a small but deeply destructive group. These were the true victims of the scandal. Not because they stood in the center of a single dramatic crime scene, but because they lived for years inside a system where the line between protector and predator had become dangerously blurred. Before investigators uncovered the full extent of the corruption, before courtroom testimony exposed the details to the public, and before commissions recommended sweeping reforms, those victims continued living ordinary lives under extraordinary circumstances, unaware that one of the people sworn to protect their community had, according to the evidence that would later emerge, become part of the criminal world they feared most. Unlike many true crime stories, this case did not revolve around a single victim whose life was taken in one horrifying act. There was no isolated crime scene surrounded by yellow tape, no family waiting through a sleepless night for detectives to deliver devastating news, and no solitary murderer whose capture would finally bring peace. The Michael Dowd case was different. Its victims were scattered across an entire city, hidden among millions of ordinary people who never realized that the damage being done to their lives was unfolding behind the shield of a police badge. The greatest tragedy of this scandal was not simply that a police officer accepted bribes or associated with narcotics traffickers. The greatest tragedy was that the institution designed to protect vulnerable communities was, in some instances, quietly helping the forces that were destroying them. Every illegal payment accepted, every warning allegedly passed to drug dealers, every investigation compromised for personal profit rippled outward into neighborhoods already struggling to survive. The true victims of this story were the people who believed they could still trust the system. East New York, Brooklyn, was one of those neighborhoods where hope and hardship existed side by side every single day. Before sunrise, the sidewalks slowly came to life. Factory workers who still had jobs waited for buses carrying worn lunch boxes. Nurses returning from overnight hospital shifts stepped off subway trains with tired eyes. Parents hurried children toward school before beginning long commutes into Manhattan. Delivery trucks rattled through narrow streets while local shopkeepers unlocked metal security gates covering storefronts that had survived countless burglaries and acts of vandalism. To someone driving through for only a few minutes, East New York could easily be reduced to newspaper stereotypes. The boarded-up buildings. The graffiti-covered walls. The abandoned lots overtaken by weeds. The burnt-out apartment blocks standing like silent reminders of years of neglect. But those images never told the entire story. Behind countless apartment windows lived hard-working families trying to build ordinary lives despite extraordinary circumstances. Grandmothers watched grandchildren after school while parents worked 2 jobs. Churches organized food drives and youth activities. Teachers stayed late every afternoon helping students who desperately needed someone to believe in them. Local basketball courts echoed with laughter as teenagers tried to forget, if only for an hour, the violence waiting beyond the fences. Most people in the neighborhood were not criminals. Most wanted exactly what families everywhere wanted: a steady paycheck, safe streets, reliable schools, a future that looked brighter than the past. Instead, they found themselves living at the center of one of the worst crack cocaine epidemics in American history. By the late 1980s, crack cocaine had transformed entire sections of New York City. Drug markets appeared almost overnight. Apartment hallways became distribution points. Street corners operated like outdoor businesses 24 hours a day. Lookouts stood at intersections pretending to talk with friends while quietly watching for police cars. Runners moved narcotics from hidden stash houses to waiting customers within seconds. Cash changed hands so quickly that dealers sometimes earned thousands of dollars in a single evening. With enormous profits came relentless violence. Territory became everything. A single block could generate enough money to justify murder. Arguments that might once have ended with angry words increasingly ended with gunfire. Residents became experts at reading danger without anyone teaching them. Children learned not to look toward sudden shouting. Parents instinctively pulled sons and daughters away from unfamiliar groups gathered near building entrances. Older residents memorized which streets were safest after dark and which corners should never be crossed alone. Fear slowly became routine. Perhaps the cruelest part of that reality was how ordinary it began to feel. A helicopter circling overhead no longer caused people to stop what they were doing. Police sirens faded into the background noise of everyday life. The sound of distant gunfire was often followed not by panic but by quiet resignation. Another shooting. Another ambulance. Another family whose life would never be the same. Within this environment, trust became one of the community's most valuable resources. Witnesses willing to cooperate with investigators risked retaliation. Victims reporting crimes often worried that neighbors would label them informants. Parents constantly balanced teaching children to respect the police while also warning them to stay cautious in dangerous situations. Every relationship depended on confidence that authorities would act honestly. That confidence was far more fragile than many outsiders realized. Imagine standing at your apartment window late one evening. You watch police officers arrest a drug dealer who has terrorized the block for months. Neighbors quietly celebrate behind closed curtains. Perhaps tomorrow children can finally play outside without fear. Then, less than 24 hours later, the same dealer returns to the exact same corner. Smiling. Laughing. Conducting business as though nothing had happened. People notice. Questions begin spreading through the neighborhood. How did he get out so quickly? Who warned him? Who protected him? Rumors become unavoidable. Whether every rumor was accurate mattered less than the growing belief that something inside the system had gone terribly wrong. That belief changed behavior. Witnesses became reluctant. Victims stopped reporting smaller crimes. Community meetings grew increasingly frustrated. The wall separating police and residents became higher with every unanswered question. When investigators later examined Michael Dowd's activities, they argued that corruption produced consequences extending far beyond financial crimes. Every warning allegedly provided to narcotics traffickers allowed drugs to remain on neighborhood streets. Every compromised investigation protected organizations that profited from addiction. Every dishonest decision strengthened criminal enterprises already responsible for widespread violence. The victims included people who never learned the names of the officers involved. Among those most deeply affected were families struggling with addiction. Crack cocaine rarely destroyed only one person. It spread through entire households. Parents watched sons disappear into dependency. Children waited by apartment windows for mothers who never came home. Savings accounts vanished. Furniture was sold. Rent went unpaid. Marriages collapsed under unbearable pressure. Entire family histories divided into two periods. Before addiction. After addiction. Treatment programs struggled to keep pace with overwhelming demand. Emergency rooms filled with overdose victims. Social workers confronted situations no textbook could adequately prepare them for. Teachers noticed students arriving hungry because household income had disappeared into drug purchases. Every successful narcotics operation created another chain of suffering extending far beyond the individuals making the sales. If corrupt law enforcement officers helped those operations survive, even indirectly, the human consequences multiplied beyond calculation. Another group of overlooked victims consisted of honest police officers. Thousands of members of the NYPD reported for duty every day with sincere intentions. They responded to shootings. They entered burning buildings. They rescued children. They arrested violent offenders. Many risked their lives for complete strangers without expecting recognition. Their commitment to public service was genuine. Yet every corrupt officer damaged the reputation of all the others. When citizens lose confidence in police, they rarely distinguish between individuals. A witness deciding whether to cooperate does not always know which officer deserves trust. A frightened victim calling 911 cannot immediately separate honest professionals from dishonest ones. Every scandal casts a shadow across an entire institution. Honest officers inherited that burden despite having committed no wrongdoing themselves. Many spent years rebuilding relationships that corruption had destroyed. One conversation at a time. One investigation at a time. One neighborhood meeting at a time. Trust, once broken, returns painfully slowly. The Michael Dowd investigation would later reveal another deeply troubling reality. According to subsequent findings, concerns about his conduct had surfaced long before his arrest. Complaints had reportedly accumulated over several years. Questions had been raised. Preliminary inquiries had taken place. Yet meaningful intervention never stopped the alleged misconduct before it expanded. For ordinary citizens, that revelation proved almost as shocking as the crimes themselves. People naturally expect institutions to recognize warning signs. They expect repeated complaints to trigger serious review. They believe accountability systems exist precisely to prevent corruption from becoming deeply rooted. When those expectations fail, public confidence suffers enormously. Imagine filing a complaint against a police officer. Imagine overcoming fear of retaliation because you believe honesty will ultimately prevail. Then imagine hearing nothing. Weeks become months. Months become years. The officer remains on patrol. Eventually, others witnessing similar behavior decide there is little point speaking up. Silence becomes self-protection. That silence benefits corruption. It also isolates honest officers trying to expose wrongdoing within their own ranks. Despite these challenges, East New York never stopped fighting for itself. Community organizations continued mentoring young people. Pastors opened church doors every evening. Volunteers organized neighborhood cleanups. Parents attended school meetings determined to improve educational opportunities. Residents refused to let crime define every aspect of their identity. Their resilience rarely attracted national attention. Television cameras usually arrived only after shootings. Newspapers focused on violence rather than perseverance. Yet perseverance remained. Quiet. Determined. Uncelebrated. It was these ordinary people who ultimately carried the greatest burden of the scandal. Not because they appeared dramatically in courtroom testimony, but because they lived every day inside a community struggling to survive, while some of those entrusted with protecting it were, according to the evidence later presented in court and before the Mullen Commission, participating in the very criminal ecosystem that had brought so much suffering. Before investigators revealed the full scope of Michael Dowd's activities, before prosecutors assembled their case, and before the public learned just how extensive the allegations had become, the residents of East New York continued living ordinary lives beneath extraordinary pressure. They could not yet see how deeply corruption had spread, but they could already feel its consequences in quieter ways, in unanswered questions, broken confidence, and the growing suspicion that the line separating law from lawlessness had become far more fragile than anyone had imagined. The first clues that something was profoundly wrong did not appear in the form of a dramatic confession or a single piece of undeniable evidence. They emerged slowly, scattered across different files, different agencies, and different conversations. One complaint alone could be dismissed as the frustration of an arrested suspect. A single rumor could be written off as neighborhood gossip. An anonymous phone call could be forgotten by the end of a shift. But when similar stories surfaced again and again, each one pointing in the same direction, an unsettling pattern began to take shape. For years, that pattern remained largely invisible. Inside the New York City Police Department, Michael Dowd continued wearing the same uniform, driving the same patrol cars, and exercising the same authority granted to every police officer. To many colleagues, he appeared to be just another patrol officer working one of the city's toughest assignments. To residents who occasionally saw him on the streets of East New York, he looked no different from any other officer responding to calls or patrolling neighborhoods overwhelmed by crime. Appearances, however, can be remarkably deceptive. Long before Dowd's eventual arrest, complaints concerning his conduct had already entered official channels. According to findings that later became public, more than a dozen allegations and internal reports concerning his behavior accumulated over several years. Individually, none of them resulted in disciplinary action capable of stopping his career. Collectively, they would later raise one of the most uncomfortable questions in the entire scandal. How could so many warning signs fail to trigger decisive intervention? The answer was not simple. Police departments receive complaints for many reasons. Some are well-founded. Others are filed by individuals angry about being arrested or questioned. Investigators must distinguish legitimate accusations from false or retaliatory claims, a process requiring evidence rather than suspicion. Yet the Dowd case suggested something more troubling. Repeated allegations were not effectively connected. Patterns were not recognized quickly enough. Individual incidents remained isolated instead of being viewed as part of a larger picture. This failure would later become one of the central criticisms directed at the NYPD's internal oversight systems. While questions quietly accumulated inside administrative files, life continued on the streets. Drug organizations expanded their operations. Cash flowed through East New York in staggering amounts. Violence remained a constant presence. Residents continued reporting crimes, hoping that each call would bring meaningful action. Many never realized that investigators outside the NYPD had already begun paying close attention. The agency that ultimately uncovered the conspiracy was not the New York City Police Department itself. It was the Suffolk County Police Department on Long Island. The investigation began for reasons unrelated to exposing one corrupt patrol officer. Suffolk County detectives had been pursuing narcotics investigations that gradually revealed connections extending far beyond their own jurisdiction. As surveillance expanded, investigators noticed something deeply unusual. Certain individuals involved in drug trafficking maintained regular contact with a New York City police officer. At first glance, such contact might not appear extraordinary. Police officers routinely interact with suspects, confidential informants, and individuals involved in criminal investigations. Context matters. What attracted investigators' attention was the nature and frequency of those meetings. Rather than isolated encounters connected to official police work, the contacts suggested relationships extending well beyond legitimate law enforcement activity. Experienced detectives understood the seriousness of what they might be observing. Accusing a police officer of corruption demanded overwhelming evidence. Speculation would never be enough. Every observation required documentation. Every meeting required verification. Every conclusion required independent support. The investigation therefore proceeded with extraordinary patience. Surveillance teams monitored movements over weeks and months rather than days. Investigators compared observations against financial records, intelligence reports, and information gathered from confidential sources. Each new piece of evidence was evaluated carefully before being added to the growing case file. Their goal was not merely to identify suspicious behavior. Their goal was to determine whether criminal conduct could be proven beyond reasonable doubt. As evidence accumulated, investigators allegedly observed conduct that appeared increasingly inconsistent with lawful police work. Meetings with known narcotics traffickers. Cash changing hands. Activities suggesting cocaine transactions. Relationships that seemed difficult to explain through legitimate investigative duties alone. Each observation strengthened investigators' confidence that they were uncovering something far more significant than isolated misconduct. Meanwhile, on the streets of Brooklyn, residents continued noticing peculiar patterns. Drug dealers who seemed unusually confident. Operations that somehow survived repeated police attention. Individuals who appeared remarkably well informed about impending law enforcement activity. Most people lacked access to the evidence investigators were quietly assembling. They possessed only personal observations. Questions. Suspicions. Those suspicions, though impossible for residents to prove, contributed to an atmosphere where confidence in public institutions continued eroding. Inside law enforcement, secrecy became essential. Corruption investigations involving police officers carry unique risks. If compromised officers learn they are under surveillance, evidence can disappear overnight. Witnesses may become intimidated. Financial records can be altered. Confidential investigative techniques may be exposed. For these reasons, only a limited number of investigators knew the full scope of the operation. The investigation advanced methodically. Every surveillance report added another layer. Every corroborated meeting strengthened the case. Every verified observation reduced the possibility that investigators had misunderstood what they were seeing. Eventually, authorities believed they possessed sufficient evidence to move toward arrests. The operation required careful coordination. Arresting a police officer differs significantly from arresting an ordinary suspect. Officers possess firearms. They understand investigative procedures. They recognize surveillance techniques. Planning had to minimize unnecessary risks while preserving critical evidence. On May 7, 1992, that planning reached its conclusion. Michael Dowd and several associates were arrested during a coordinated operation. The news spread rapidly through law enforcement circles. A New York City police officer had not simply been accused of accepting occasional bribes. He now faced allegations involving narcotics trafficking, corruption, and organized criminal activity. The arrest itself marked only the beginning. Search warrants executed in connection with the investigation produced additional evidence examined by prosecutors preparing federal charges. Investigators interviewed witnesses. Financial records underwent detailed analysis. Associates faced difficult choices. Some denied wrongdoing. Others began considering cooperation agreements with prosecutors. As the investigation widened, authorities identified additional individuals allegedly connected to the corruption network. Among those arrested were Kenneth Urell and Daniel Urell, along with other current or former law enforcement personnel and individuals associated with narcotics trafficking. Each arrest increased pressure on everyone involved. Complex criminal conspiracies often evolve rapidly once participants recognize the strength of the government's evidence. Some defendants choose trial. Others negotiate plea agreements. Some decide cooperation offers the best opportunity to reduce potential sentences. Federal investigators understood this dynamic well. Every cooperating witness possessed the potential to illuminate previously hidden aspects of the organization. Every truthful statement could lead investigators toward additional evidence. The investigation gradually shifted from proving isolated criminal acts to understanding how an entire network had allegedly functioned for years. Questions multiplied. Who supplied information? Who accepted money? Who benefited financially? How extensive had the corruption become? Just as importantly, investigators sought to determine why earlier warning signs had failed to prevent the misconduct. The public, learning fragments of the story through newspaper reports, struggled to comprehend the scale of the allegations. Police corruption was not entirely new to New York. Previous investigations, including the Knapp Commission during the early 1970s, had already exposed serious misconduct involving some officers. Many citizens believed those scandals belonged to history. The Dowd investigation suggested otherwise. It implied that corruption had not disappeared. Instead, according to later findings, its character had evolved. Rather than merely accepting payments to ignore illegal activity, some officers allegedly became active participants in criminal enterprises. That distinction profoundly disturbed both the public and honest members of law enforcement. Ignoring crime represents one form of corruption. Helping criminals succeed represents another entirely. As prosecutors organized evidence for upcoming court proceedings, investigators recognized that the case extended beyond individual criminal responsibility. The evidence pointed toward institutional questions that would soon receive national attention. How should police departments monitor officers assigned to high-risk narcotics units? What safeguards could identify unexplained wealth? How should repeated civilian complaints be evaluated? When should outside agencies become involved? These questions would eventually shape major reforms. But in the weeks immediately following the arrests, the focus remained on building the strongest possible criminal case. Boxes of documents filled investigative offices. Surveillance logs were reviewed repeatedly. Recorded observations were compared against witness testimony. Every timeline had to be precise. Every allegation required independent corroboration. Federal prosecutors understood that defense attorneys would scrutinize every detail. Any inconsistency could weaken the credibility of the entire investigation. The burden of proof remained extraordinarily high. Yet as evidence continued accumulating, one conclusion became increasingly difficult to avoid. Investigators believed they had uncovered one of the most significant police corruption cases New York City had seen in decades. What had begun as scattered complaints and isolated suspicions had developed into an investigation exposing alleged criminal conduct reaching deep into the responsibilities entrusted to sworn police officers. The discovery did more than prepare the way for courtroom proceedings. It forced an entire city to confront the possibility that, for years, some of the people empowered to fight organized crime had instead become part of it, leaving behind not only criminal charges but a profound crisis of public trust that would continue unfolding long after the handcuffs were placed on Michael Dowd's wrists. The arrests marked a turning point, but they did not immediately answer the most important questions. In many ways, they created even more uncertainty. For investigators, taking Michael Dowd into custody was only the beginning of a much larger task. An arrest could stop ongoing criminal activity, but it could not explain how the alleged corruption had grown, who had benefited from it, or how many people had participated. The evidence collected over months of surveillance painted a troubling picture, yet investigators understood that organized corruption rarely depends upon a single individual. Networks survive because relationships survive. Money flows because multiple people protect its movement. Information leaks because someone chooses to pass it along. If Dowd had truly become part of an organized criminal enterprise, then identifying every connection became just as important as proving his own guilt. The investigation expanded in several directions simultaneously. Financial investigators examined bank records, property purchases, vehicle registrations, and spending habits. They searched for discrepancies between legitimate income and visible wealth. Detectives reviewed years of police reports, arrest records, and departmental paperwork, looking for patterns that might reveal compromised investigations. Prosecutors interviewed witnesses who had once remained silent, believing that the arrests might finally encourage cooperation. Some witnesses spoke cautiously. Others remained deeply afraid. Fear had become a habit in neighborhoods where narcotics organizations exercised enormous influence. Even after the arrests, many people wondered whether powerful individuals remained untouched. Some questioned whether corrupt officers still worked inside the department. Others feared retaliation from criminal organizations that had not disappeared simply because one investigation had succeeded. Winning trust required patience. Federal investigators and prosecutors could not simply ask residents to believe the system had suddenly changed. Confidence had to be earned. Meanwhile, attorneys representing the defendants began preparing their own strategies. Every major corruption case creates competing narratives. Prosecutors argued that they had uncovered an organized criminal conspiracy involving sworn police officers. Defense attorneys examined every investigative step, searching for weaknesses. Was surveillance conducted properly? Could witnesses be trusted? Had informants received favorable treatment in exchange for testimony? Were investigators interpreting innocent meetings as criminal ones? These questions were not merely procedural. They represented fundamental principles of the criminal justice system. Even in cases involving serious allegations, every defendant remains entitled to challenge the government's evidence. Investigators therefore continued strengthening the case. Every statement required corroboration whenever possible. Every financial transaction had to fit within an accurate timeline. Every allegation needed support from physical evidence, surveillance records, or multiple independent witnesses. The complexity of the investigation became increasingly apparent. Drug trafficking organizations rarely maintain detailed written records. Corrupt relationships often rely on verbal agreements. Participants deliberately avoid creating evidence that can later be used against them. As a result, investigators frequently relied upon combining numerous smaller pieces of information into one coherent picture. One surveillance observation alone might prove very little. One financial record might appear ordinary. One witness statement could always be challenged. Together, however, those pieces sometimes revealed patterns impossible to ignore. Attention soon turned toward individuals believed to have worked alongside Dowd. Among those facing charges were Kenneth Urell and Daniel Urell, along with other individuals connected to the alleged conspiracy. Each defendant faced difficult choices. Maintain complete denial. Proceed to trial. Or cooperate with prosecutors. Federal investigations often place enormous pressure on criminal organizations by encouraging cooperation. Someone facing substantial prison time may decide that assisting investigators offers the best opportunity for a reduced sentence. Such decisions can dramatically reshape an investigation. Individuals who once protected one another begin describing meetings, financial arrangements, and criminal activities in extraordinary detail. Investigators understood this dynamic well. Every new interview possessed the potential to reveal another layer of the organization. The challenge, however, was separating truthful cooperation from self-serving exaggeration. Witnesses seeking leniency sometimes possess powerful incentives to minimize their own responsibility while emphasizing someone else's. For that reason, prosecutors rarely rely upon a single cooperating witness. Independent corroboration remains essential. Documents, surveillance, financial evidence, telephone records. Everything must fit together. As interviews continued, investigators developed a clearer understanding of how corruption allegedly functioned inside portions of the narcotics enforcement environment. According to evidence later presented in court and subsequent public proceedings, corruption extended beyond simply ignoring criminal behavior. Investigators alleged that confidential information had been shared. Drug traffickers had allegedly received warnings before planned police actions. Property seized during investigation sometimes failed to remain within proper evidence channels. Illegal profits allegedly circulated among participants. Perhaps most disturbing of all was the suggestion that official police authority itself had become a valuable commodity. A badge commands immediate respect. A marked patrol car attracts little suspicion. A police radio provides information unavailable to ordinary citizens. When those tools are used dishonestly, they become force multipliers for criminal organizations. This reality deeply troubled investigators. Traditional criminals operate while constantly avoiding law enforcement. Corrupt officers possess knowledge of law enforcement tactics themselves. They understand investigative procedures. They recognize surveillance techniques. They know how evidence is collected. That knowledge can significantly complicate criminal investigations. Outside the courtroom, the story gradually reached the public. Newspapers followed every development. Television stations reported new allegations as they emerged. For many New Yorkers, the details seemed almost unbelievable. Some initially struggled to accept that police officers could become so deeply involved in narcotics trafficking. Others viewed the investigation as confirmation of suspicions they had held for years. Reactions varied dramatically depending upon personal experience. Communities that had repeatedly questioned police integrity often felt vindicated. Families with relatives serving honestly in law enforcement worried that public confidence would unfairly collapse. Police officers themselves experienced conflicting emotions. Many expressed anger toward colleagues whose alleged misconduct had damaged the reputation of an entire profession. Others feared the scandal would overshadow countless acts of courage performed daily by honest officers. Morale became increasingly complicated. The overwhelming majority of NYPD personnel had no involvement in Dowd's crimes. Yet every corruption headline affected them nonetheless. Trust does not distinguish easily between individuals. One scandal can influence perceptions of thousands. Inside government offices, attention shifted beyond criminal prosecution toward institutional responsibility. How had repeated complaints failed to stop the misconduct? Were internal investigative procedures adequate? Should oversight mechanisms be strengthened? These questions became impossible to ignore. The case no longer concerned only individual criminal liability. It now challenged the effectiveness of systems designed to prevent corruption before it became deeply rooted. The investigation also highlighted another uncomfortable truth. Corruption often develops gradually rather than suddenly. Small ethical compromises can normalize larger ones. Once individuals begin benefiting financially from misconduct, protecting those benefits may require increasingly serious crimes. Lies become routine. Records become manipulated. Relationships with criminal organizations deepen. Each decision creates pressure to conceal previous decisions. Eventually, withdrawal becomes extraordinarily difficult. This progression would later become one of the central lessons examined by policing experts. Preventing corruption requires addressing early warning signs rather than waiting for large criminal conspiracies to emerge. As prosecutors finalized charges, another reality became increasingly evident. Michael Dowd himself possessed knowledge extending far beyond his own actions. He understood daily operations inside the precinct. He knew which procedures had succeeded and which had failed. He knew how corruption could remain hidden. That knowledge would eventually become enormously valuable to investigators. But first, prosecutors needed to determine whether cooperation was possible. Plea negotiations represent one of the most delicate stages of complex criminal investigations. Defendants may receive reduced sentencing recommendations in exchange for truthful, complete cooperation. Such agreements are controversial. Some believe serious offenders deserve maximum punishment regardless of assistance provided afterward. Others argue that exposing larger criminal networks sometimes requires cooperation from participants themselves. Ultimately, prosecutors weigh the value of information against the seriousness of the crimes involved. In Dowd's case, those decisions would later shape public understanding of corruption inside the NYPD. As the investigation continued unfolding, one conclusion became increasingly clear. This was no longer simply the story of one dishonest patrol officer. It had become an examination of institutional vulnerability. Power without accountability. Authority without oversight. Warning signs without effective intervention. Every new piece of evidence expanded the scope of those questions. Behind every investigative file stood ordinary citizens whose confidence in law enforcement had been shaken. Behind every surveillance photograph stood months of careful work conducted by investigators determined to uncover the truth regardless of where it led. And behind every courtroom document stood a city waiting to learn just how deeply corruption had penetrated one of the nation's largest police departments. The answers would not emerge overnight. They would come through guilty pleas, sworn testimony, judicial proceedings, and eventually a public commission whose findings would force New York to confront uncomfortable realities about policing, accountability, and the fragile nature of public trust. Before that reckoning could begin, however, prosecutors still needed one crucial element: the testimony of the man who had spent years living inside the corruption they were trying to understand. The investigation had now reached a stage where the evidence was no longer confined to surveillance logs, financial records, or confidential informants. Detectives believed they understood the outline of the conspiracy, but the outline alone was not enough. They needed to understand the machinery inside it. They needed to know how decisions were made, how money moved, who benefited, and perhaps most importantly, why no one had stopped it sooner. Michael Dowd was no longer simply a suspect. He had become the person who understood the system better than anyone else. For investigators, proving criminal acts was only one objective. Understanding the culture that allowed those acts to flourish was another. The distinction mattered because corruption of this scale rarely survives through secrecy alone. It survives because enough people fail to ask difficult questions. It survives because warning signs become routine. It survives because unusual behavior gradually begins to look normal. That realization changed the direction of the investigation. Instead of asking only what crimes had occurred, investigators began asking how those crimes had remained hidden for so many years. The answers would prove uncomfortable. Federal prosecutors continued assembling an enormous volume of evidence. Investigators compared surveillance reports with police activity logs. Financial analysts examined years of purchases, bank deposits, vehicle registrations, and property records. Telephone records were reconstructed into timelines. Every documented meeting between suspected participants was carefully reviewed. No single document appeared dramatic on its own. A bank transaction. A vehicle registration. A surveillance photograph. A recorded observation. Each seemed almost ordinary in isolation. Together, however, they formed a picture that prosecutors believed demonstrated long-term criminal conduct rather than isolated bad decisions. At the same time, investigators continued interviewing individuals connected to the case. Some witnesses had spent years living inside Brooklyn's narcotics trade. Others had encountered corrupt officers while attempting to operate drug organizations. Some had once benefited from police protection. Others had suffered because competing criminal groups enjoyed that protection. Each interview added another piece to an increasingly complicated puzzle. Naturally, not every witness told the same story. Memories differed. Motives differed. Some hoped to reduce their own criminal exposure. Others feared retaliation if they revealed too much. Investigators therefore treated every statement cautiously. Verification became the guiding principle. Whenever a witness described a meeting, detectives searched for surveillance records confirming it. Whenever someone discussed money, financial investigators looked for supporting transactions. Whenever confidential information was allegedly passed to drug traffickers, prosecutors searched police records for corresponding operational details. Only facts that could withstand scrutiny would eventually appear in court. That careful approach became especially important because the defendants included police officers. Jurors would expect extraordinary evidence before believing that individuals sworn to enforce the law had themselves become participants in organized crime. The burden resting on prosecutors was immense. Meanwhile, the arrest sent shockwaves throughout the New York City Police Department. For thousands of honest officers, the investigation represented something deeply personal. Many had spent years risking their lives in neighborhoods devastated by narcotics trafficking. Some had attended the funerals of fellow officers killed in the line of duty. Others had worked exhausting shifts pursuing dangerous criminals while missing birthdays, anniversaries, and holidays with their families. To those officers, the allegations against Michael Dowd felt like a profound betrayal. A police badge carries more than legal authority. It carries the trust of colleagues. Officers depend upon one another during dangerous encounters. They expect backup to arrive. They expect reports to be truthful. They expect fellow officers to protect each other from violent criminals, not to protect criminals themselves. Every corruption scandal weakens that confidence. Even officers completely unconnected to the investigation suddenly found themselves answering difficult questions from neighbors, relatives, and friends. People asked whether corruption was common. Whether everyone knew. Whether supervisors had ignored obvious warning signs. Few honest officers had satisfying answers. Outside police headquarters, public reaction grew stronger with every newspaper article. Editorials questioned the effectiveness of internal oversight. Community leaders demanded accountability. Residents who had spent years reporting suspicious police behavior wondered why their complaints had produced so little action. Some felt vindicated. Others simply felt exhausted. To many families living in East New York, the scandal confirmed something they had quietly feared for years. They had watched drug dealers operate with remarkable confidence. They had seen investigations collapse without explanation. They had wondered how certain individuals always seemed prepared before police operations occurred. Now, at least partially, those questions appeared to have answers. Still, investigators remained careful not to overstate their conclusions. One of the greatest dangers in any major corruption case is assuming that everyone within an institution shares responsibility. That was not supported by the evidence. The overwhelming majority of NYPD officers had no connection to Dowd's criminal conduct. Many had worked tirelessly under extraordinarily difficult conditions. Many had never suspected the extent of the corruption unfolding around them. Distinguishing between individual criminal responsibility and institutional vulnerability became increasingly important. The investigation focused on those directly involved while also examining weaknesses that had allowed misconduct to continue. Those weaknesses gradually became impossible to ignore. According to later findings, complaints regarding Dowd had accumulated over several years. Civilian allegations. Internal reports. Preliminary inquiries. Yet no sustained intervention stopped the pattern before federal investigators eventually built their case. This reality disturbed police reform advocates almost as much as the crimes themselves. Institutions cannot prevent every dishonest employee. But they are expected to recognize patterns before misconduct becomes deeply entrenched. The Dowd investigation suggested those safeguards had not functioned effectively. Attention increasingly shifted toward supervisory practices. How carefully were complaints reviewed? How frequently were officers reassigned after repeated allegations? Were unusual financial circumstances examined? Did internal investigators possess sufficient independence? Each question exposed another possible point of failure. The investigation had evolved far beyond proving narcotics offenses. It had become a study of accountability itself. While these broader discussions continued, prosecutors focused on the practical realities of preparing for trial. Complex conspiracy cases demand extraordinary organization. Evidence must be presented logically. Timelines must remain consistent. Witness testimony must support physical evidence rather than contradict it. Jurors unfamiliar with police procedures must be able to understand not only what allegedly happened but why it mattered. Boxes of investigative material filled federal offices. Photographs were catalogued. Financial summaries were prepared. Witness lists expanded. Attorneys anticipated months of legal arguments before the first juror would hear opening statements. Behind closed doors, another process quietly began. Negotiations. Federal prosecutors recognized that Michael Dowd possessed information extending far beyond the charges against him. He understood daily operations inside the precinct. He knew relationships investigators had not yet fully mapped. He knew how corrupt officers allegedly communicated. He knew how illicit payments were arranged. He knew where oversight had failed. That knowledge represented something investigators could never obtain through surveillance alone. Whether he would share it remained uncertain. For defendants facing overwhelming evidence, plea agreements often become serious considerations. Such agreements never erase criminal responsibility. Instead, they reflect a difficult balance within the justice system. Sometimes prosecutors accept reduced sentencing recommendations because truthful cooperation allows broader criminal organizations to be exposed. These decisions frequently generate public debate. Victims sometimes believe offenders receive excessive leniency. Investigators argue that larger conspiracies cannot always be dismantled without insider testimony. The Dowd case would eventually become one of those situations. But before any agreement could be reached, prosecutors needed confidence that whatever information Dowd provided would be truthful, complete, and independently verifiable. Nothing less would be acceptable. Every claim would require corroboration. Every allegation would demand supporting evidence. The credibility of the entire investigation depended upon that discipline. As weeks turned into months, the pressure surrounding the case intensified. The media followed every development. Community organizations demanded reform. Police leadership faced increasing scrutiny. Government officials recognized that the scandal threatened not only individual reputations but public confidence in one of the largest police departments in the United States. The investigation had become something much larger than anyone initially imagined. What had started with surveillance of suspicious activity had evolved into a searching examination of power, ethics, institutional oversight, and the fragile relationship between law enforcement and the communities it serves. For investigators, however, one final step remained before the full story could be told. Evidence could establish criminal conduct. Documents could reveal financial gain. Surveillance could place suspects together. But only someone who had lived inside the corruption could explain how it actually worked from the inside. Soon, Michael Dowd would begin doing exactly that. His testimony would shock the public, embarrass the NYPD, and expose a level of corruption far deeper than many New Yorkers had ever imagined. More importantly, it would force an entire city to confront an uncomfortable truth: the greatest threat to public trust is not simply that corruption exists, but that it can quietly become part of the ordinary routine until someone finally has the courage, or the evidence, to expose it. The courtroom was unusually quiet as spectators settled into their seats. Reporters arranged notebooks across narrow wooden benches. Attorneys reviewed stacks of documents that represented years of investigation. Federal prosecutors prepared exhibits that had been assembled piece by piece through surveillance, financial analysis, witness interviews, and countless hours of investigative work. What had begun as scattered allegations of police misconduct had now become one of the most closely watched corruption cases involving the New York City Police Department in decades. For many people inside the courtroom, the proceedings represented much more than the prosecution of a single former police officer. The case had become a test of accountability. The public wanted to know whether the justice system could investigate one of its own with the same determination used against organized crime. Residents of East New York wanted answers to questions that had lingered for years. Honest police officers wanted the truth established because they understood that every day the scandal remained unresolved further damaged public confidence in the profession they had chosen. The stakes extended far beyond the fate of Michael Dowd himself. By the time the case reached this stage, prosecutors possessed an extensive body of evidence. Surveillance records, financial documentation, witness testimony, investigative reports. Perhaps most significantly, they also had the cooperation of Michael Dowd. In 1993, Dowd entered guilty pleas to federal charges that included racketeering, conspiracy involving narcotics trafficking, and accepting bribes. His decision fundamentally changed the direction of the proceedings. Instead of contesting every allegation, he admitted responsibility for serious criminal conduct and agreed to cooperate with investigators. That cooperation did not erase the crimes, nor did it eliminate the consequences he would eventually face. But it provided investigators with something no surveillance operation could fully capture: an insider's explanation of how the corruption functioned. During interviews with prosecutors and investigators, Dowd described a gradual moral collapse rather than a single catastrophic decision. He explained that the earliest compromises appeared insignificant. Small favors, free meals, complimentary drinks, minor benefits that seemed almost harmless. Over time, however, those small compromises made larger ones easier to justify. Eventually, according to his admissions, accepting money from drug traffickers no longer felt like crossing an impossible line. The boundary had already been moved many times before. For investigators studying police corruption, this progression became one of the most important lessons to emerge from the case. Ethical collapse rarely begins with the largest crime. It often begins with the smallest exception. Each compromise lowers resistance to the next. By the time major criminal conduct occurs, the individual may already have spent years convincing himself that previous misconduct was acceptable. Dowd's admissions extended far beyond accepting bribes. According to his testimony and guilty plea, he acknowledged participating in conduct that directly undermined legitimate law enforcement. He admitted accepting payments from narcotics traffickers. He admitted providing protection that benefited criminal organizations. He described circumstances in which confidential police information was improperly disclosed. His testimony painted a picture of corruption that prosecutors argued had become systematic rather than occasional. Perhaps the most shocking aspect of his cooperation came not from the specific criminal acts themselves but from his description of how ordinary those acts had become within his own thinking. What had once seemed unimaginable gradually became routine. That psychological transformation disturbed observers almost as much as the crimes. Many people expected corruption to involve greed. Few expected it to involve such complete normalization. As court proceedings continued, prosecutors carefully presented evidence supporting the broader conspiracy. Financial records demonstrated spending inconsistent with Dowd's legitimate police salary. Investigators described months of surveillance. Witnesses explained relationships between corrupt officers and narcotics traffickers. Rather than relying upon dramatic courtroom confrontations, prosecutors built their case through accumulation. Each piece of evidence strengthened the next. Together they formed a narrative that jurors and observers could follow from beginning to end. Defense attorneys continued fulfilling their responsibility by examining witnesses carefully and challenging aspects of the government's case where appropriate. The adversarial process remained essential. Even defendants who admit guilt retain important legal rights. Courts exist not simply to punish wrongdoing but to ensure that justice is administered according to law. The proceedings attracted extraordinary public attention. National newspapers covered the story. Television news programs summarized developments each evening. Law enforcement agencies across the United States followed the case closely, recognizing that its implications extended well beyond New York City. Police corruption had been exposed before. What made the Dowd case particularly significant was the depth of the admitted misconduct and the institutional questions it raised. Outside the courthouse, reactions remained divided. Some members of the public expressed relief that the investigation had finally produced accountability. Others remained angry that the corruption had continued for so many years before decisive action occurred. Community leaders emphasized that convictions alone could not repair damaged relationships between residents and law enforcement. Rebuilding trust would require long-term reform rather than a single successful prosecution. Inside the NYPD, the proceedings prompted difficult conversations. Many officers viewed Dowd's guilty plea as confirmation of a profound betrayal. They understood that every honest arrest they made would now occur under increased public skepticism. Years of dedicated service by thousands of officers had been overshadowed by the actions of a relatively small number of corrupt individuals. Yet many also believed accountability was essential. Allowing corruption to remain hidden would ultimately inflict even greater damage upon the department's reputation. The legal process continued through 1994. Although Dowd had cooperated with investigators, the court also considered the seriousness and duration of his criminal conduct. The judge examined the evidence carefully before imposing sentence. Cooperation with authorities can influence sentencing. It does not eliminate responsibility. The court recognized both realities simultaneously. In July 1994, Michael Dowd received a federal prison sentence of 14 years. The sentence reflected the court's conclusion that his abuse of public trust had caused extraordinary harm. According to the court's assessment, the crimes were not isolated lapses in judgment but sustained misconduct carried out over an extended period while serving as a sworn police officer. The punishment carried symbolic importance as well. Police officers possess powers unavailable to ordinary citizens. Society grants those powers because officers are expected to exercise them honestly. When those powers are intentionally abused for personal gain, the damage extends beyond individual victims. Public confidence in the rule of law itself is weakened. The sentence acknowledged that broader harm. Several other individuals connected to the conspiracy also faced criminal consequences. Some entered guilty pleas. Others cooperated with investigators. Each outcome depended upon the specific evidence and legal circumstances surrounding the individual defendant. Collectively, however, the prosecutions demonstrated that the investigation had reached beyond one officer to expose a broader network of criminal relationships. For many observers, the courtroom proceedings represented the end of one chapter. In reality, they marked the beginning of another. The convictions answered important legal questions. They established criminal responsibility. They imposed punishment. But they also revealed institutional failures that could not be solved through imprisonment alone. How had repeated complaints gone unaddressed? Why had internal oversight failed to recognize warning signs earlier? What reforms were necessary to prevent similar corruption in the future? Those questions would soon become the focus of a much broader public examination. The testimony emerging from the case, combined with evidence gathered during the investigation, contributed directly to the work of what became known as the Mullen Commission. Its purpose extended beyond determining individual guilt. It sought to understand how corruption had evolved inside portions of the NYPD and what structural changes were necessary to restore public confidence. As Michael Dowd left the courtroom to begin serving his federal sentence, his legal case was largely complete. The larger story, however, was far from over. The damage caused by years of corruption could not be measured solely by prison terms. It lived in neighborhoods where trust had been broken. It lingered among honest officers forced to rebuild credibility one interaction at a time. It remained within government institutions now confronting difficult truths about accountability, supervision, and ethical leadership. The verdict had delivered justice in the legal sense. Whether it could also restore confidence in the institutions affected by the scandal would become a far more complicated question, one that New York City would continue confronting long after the courtroom doors had closed.